It was a quiet Tuesday morning in Valdosta, Georgia, January 8, 2013. The kind of morning where the biggest news is usually the lunch menu or the upcoming basketball game. At Lowndes High School, students filed into the old gymnasium for class, their chatter echoing off the polished wooden floors. But the day was about to take a turn, a dark and permanent one. Something was amiss. A group of students noticed something strange over by a stack of rolled-up wrestling mats, propped upright against the bleachers. One of them climbed up to get a better look. What they saw inside would haunt them, and the entire town, for years to come. A pair of socks, peeking out from the dark, narrow opening of one of the mats. The initial confusion quickly morphed into a dawning, sickening horror. A teacher was called over, then another. Soon the school administration was there, and the air in the gym grew thick with a silent, spreading dread. They had found a student. And he wasn't sleeping. He was wedged deep inside the mat, upside down, his body contorted in a way that defied easy explanation. The student was 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson, a quiet athletic boy known for his love of sports and his close-knit family. He had been reported missing the day before, after he failed to return home from school. His parents, Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson, had been frantic, calling everyone they knew, praying for his safe return. Their prayers had been answered in the most devastating way imaginable. The discovery sent a shockwave through the school, then the town, and eventually, the entire nation. How could this happen? How could a boy end up inside a rolled-up gym mat in the middle of his own high school? The questions began immediately, whispered in hallways and shouted in news reports. It was a scene that made no sense. A puzzle with too many pieces missing and others that simply didn't fit. The image was stark, unforgettable. A young life, extinguished in the most bizarre and unsettling of circumstances, found in a place that should have been safe. The old gym, once a place of youthful energy and competition, was now a crime scene, holding a secret that it seemed unwilling to give up. For Kendrick's family, the news was a cataclysmic blow, a nightmare from which they would never awaken. Their son, KJ, was gone. Their search had ended not with relief, but with an unthinkable reality. As paramedics and police descended upon Lowndes High, the ordinary school day was shattered. The initial reports were sparse, filled with speculation. Was it an accident? A prank gone horribly wrong? Or was it something far more sinister? Something that spoke to a darkness lurking just beneath the surface of this quiet southern town? The discovery of Kendrick Johnson's body was not an end, but a beginning. The start of a long, painful, and deeply contentious search for the truth. A search that would challenge official narratives and expose wounds that may never fully heal. When investigators began to process the scene, the details only deepened the mystery. Kendrick was found head-first inside one of the vertically stored mats, which stood about 6 feet tall and had a center opening of roughly 14 inches. He was wedged so tightly that his shoulders were pinned, his arms trapped above his head. To retrieve his body, investigators had to lay the heavy mat on its side. Kendrick was wearing his street clothes, but one of his shoes, a pair of black and white Adidas, was not on his foot. Instead, it was found lying on the floor near the base of the mats. Another shoe, belonging to someone else, was found tucked inside the mat with him, near his feet. The presence of this second shoe was an odd detail, one that would later become a focal point of debate. The condition of the scene raised immediate red flags for those who questioned the official story. Blood was present. Not a lot, but it was there. Some reports mentioned blood on the wall near the mats. Other accounts noted smears of what appeared to be blood on Kendrick's body and inside the mat itself. Why was there blood if this was a simple accident? And how did it get on the wall? The authorities would later suggest it was from Kendrick struggling, but to his family, it looked like evidence of a violent struggle, a fight for his life that he had tragically lost. The position of his body was another confounding factor. It seemed almost impossible for a boy of his size to have willingly contorted himself into such a precarious and inescapable position. Then there was the matter of the other items found near the scene. A sweatshirt, a water bottle, and a book were discovered on the bleachers nearby. Were they Kendrick's? The official theory would soon coalesce around the idea that Kendrick, realizing he had left his shoes behind, had climbed atop the mats and dove inside to retrieve them, only to become stuck. The shoe found with him inside the mat, they posited, was the one he was reaching for. But this explanation felt thin to many. It required one to believe that a teenager would choose such a dangerous and difficult method to get a shoe, rather than simply asking a friend or teacher for help, or even just knocking the mat over. The scene in the old gym was a tableau of contradictions. It was clean, yet there were signs of blood. It was a place of youthful activity, yet it held a scene of silent, solitary death. The authorities from the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office were quick to process the scene and within hours began to lean heavily toward one conclusion: accidental death. Positional asphyxia, they would call it. He got stuck and couldn't breathe. But for the Johnson family and their supporters, the scene screamed foul play. The missing shoe, the blood, the sheer unlikelihood of the scenario, it all pointed not to a tragic mistake, but to a brutal act covered up by a hastily constructed narrative. The gym had a story to tell, but it seemed as though some were not willing to listen. To understand what might have happened to Kendrick Johnson, investigators turned to the school's surveillance system. Lowndes High was equipped with numerous cameras, a network that should have provided a clear, second-by-second account of Kendrick's final hours. And at first it seemed to. The footage showed Kendrick walking through a hallway around 1:09 p.m. on January 7th, the day he disappeared. He was wearing the same clothes he was found in, carrying a book, seemingly on his way to his next class. He turned a corner, heading in the direction of the old gym, and then he vanished. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. What happened in the moments and hours that followed remains a gaping void in the official record. The problem was the cameras themselves, or rather, the footage they provided. Investigators reviewed hours and hours of tape from dozens of cameras, but the results were maddeningly incomplete. Crucially, the cameras that should have captured the entrance to the old gym and the area where the mats were stored either malfunctioned or provided obscured views. One camera pointing directly at the mats was, according to school officials, out of focus and blurry. Another camera, positioned to capture movement in the area, was inexplicably motionless, its view blocked by a single, unmoving frame of a student walking by. These were not small glitches, they were massive, critical gaps in the visual evidence at the most important moments. This lack of clear footage became a central pillar of the family's suspicions. How could a state-of-the-art surveillance system, designed for the very purpose of monitoring student activity, fail so spectacularly at the precise time and place of Kendrick's death? To the Johnsons, it was too convenient to be a coincidence. They alleged that the footage had been intentionally edited or withheld to protect the identities of those responsible for their son's death. They fought for years to gain access to all the raw footage, and when they finally received it, they claimed to find evidence of tampering, timestamps that skipped, files that appeared to be missing, and sequences that just didn't add up. The official timeline, therefore, was built on a foundation of missing information. Kendrick was last seen at 1:09 p.m. He was found the next morning around 10:30 a.m. That left a window of more than 21 hours completely unaccounted for. No one saw him enter the gym. No one saw him climb the mats. No one heard him cry for help. For the authorities, this lack of evidence supported their theory of a solitary, accidental death. But for Kendrick's family and a growing number of supporters, the silence of the cameras was deafening. It wasn't an absence of evidence, it was evidence of a cover-up, a deliberate erasure of the truth, leaving only shadows where there should have been answers. The initial autopsy, conducted by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, seemed to close the book on the case before it had even been fully opened. The GBI medical examiner concluded that Kendrick's death was accidental, caused by positional asphyxia. In layman's terms, he had become trapped in a position where he could no longer breathe. The report made no mention of significant injuries or trauma, effectively rubber-stamping the sheriff's office theory that Kendrick had fallen into the mat while reaching for his shoe. The case was officially closed. For the Johnson family, however, this explanation was not just unsatisfactory, it was an insult to their son's memory. They knew something was wrong, and they were determined to prove it. Refusing to accept the official findings, the Johnson family took the extraordinary step of having Kendrick's body exhumed for a second, independent autopsy. They hired Dr. William R. Anderson, a private pathologist, to conduct the examination in June 2013. What Dr. Anderson found was shocking and directly contradicted the GBI's conclusions. He discovered evidence of what he described as unexplained, apparent, non-accidental blunt force trauma to the right side of Kendrick's neck, near his jaw. It was a significant injury, one that the first autopsy had somehow missed or omitted. This finding suggested that Kendrick had sustained a powerful blow before his death, a blow that could have rendered him unconscious or incapacitated before he ended up in the mat. The revelations from the second autopsy didn't end there. In a grotesque and disturbing twist, Dr. Anderson discovered that Kendrick's internal organs, from his brain to his pelvis, were missing. They had been removed during the first autopsy and had not been returned to the body. In their place, his body cavity had been stuffed with crumpled up newspaper and other filler materials. This discovery was not just a procedural anomaly, it felt like a desecration, a final indignity inflicted upon their son. The GBI later claimed this was standard practice by the funeral home, but for the family, it felt like another piece of a deliberate effort to destroy evidence and conceal the truth. The conflicting findings threw the case into turmoil. One official report said accident, while a second, independent report pointed toward non-accidental blunt force trauma. This led to a third autopsy ordered as part of a renewed federal investigation. This examination, conducted by pathologists with the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, further complicated the picture, but it did confirm the presence of injuries consistent with the blunt force trauma Dr. Anderson had identified. The official narrative of a simple, tragic accident was now crumbling under the weight of competing medical evidence. The boy in the mat, it seemed, had a story to tell after all, and it was one of violence. With the official accident theory severely weakened by the second autopsy, a host of alternative theories began to circulate, fueled by whispers and rumors that had been simmering in Valdosta from the very beginning. The most prominent of these centered on two brothers, both students at Lowndes High, who had a history of conflict with Kendrick Johnson. According to some accounts, Kendrick had been involved in a fight with one of the brothers on a school bus a year earlier. The Johnsons believed this altercation was the motive for a retaliatory attack. They alleged that the brothers, and possibly other students, had confronted Kendrick in the gym, assaulted him, and then concealed his body in the mat. This theory gained traction as inconsistencies in the brothers' alibis emerged. Initially, one brother told investigators he was in class, but his teacher couldn't confirm his presence for the entire period. The other brother claimed to be on his way to a wrestling tournament out of town. However, the Johnson family's legal team presented evidence suggesting their timelines didn't quite add up, leaving windows of opportunity for them to have been in the gym. The brothers, whose father was an FBI agent, vehemently denied any involvement. They maintained their innocence, stating they were nowhere near the old gym when Kendrick disappeared, and that they were being unfairly targeted based on old grudges and unfounded speculation. The theory wasn't just about a schoolyard fight that escalated. It quickly grew to include accusations of a massive cover-up involving local and state law enforcement. The Johnson family and their attorneys pointed to what they considered a series of suspicious actions: the rushed conclusion of an accidental death, the failure to secure the gym as a potential crime scene, the inexplicably missing surveillance footage, and the powerful position of the brothers' father. They painted a picture of a conspiracy where influential figures had intervened to protect the guilty parties, steering the investigation away from foul play from the very beginning. These accusations created a deep and bitter divide within the community, pitting neighbor against neighbor. The narrative of a cover-up was powerful and persuasive for many. It offered an explanation for the bizarre set of circumstances that seemed to defy logic. If Kendrick had been murdered, and if the perpetrators had connections, it would explain why the investigation seemed so flawed, and why the official story felt so forced. It transformed the case from a tragic mystery into a story of small-town corruption and a fight against a powerful system. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office and the GBI repeatedly and forcefully denied these allegations, insisting their investigation was thorough, and that their conclusions were based solely on the evidence they had. But in a case with so few answers, suspicion became its own form of evidence. In the face of official indifference and a closed case, most families might have been forced to retreat into their grief. But the Johnsons were not most families. Led by the quiet determination of Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson, they refused to let their son's memory be defined by a questionable narrative of accidental death. Their private sorrow was transformed into a public crusade for justice, a relentless campaign to force the world to look closer at what happened inside that gymnasium. They believed their son was murdered, and they would not rest until they had answers and accountability. Their fight began in Valdosta, but it would soon capture the attention of the entire country. The Johnsons, along with their supporters, organized protests and rallies, their voices rising from the steps of the local courthouse to the streets of the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta. They held signs with Kendrick's picture, chanting "No justice, no peace, and who killed KJ?" Their persistence was remarkable. They became amateur investigators, poring over documents, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and hiring their own legal and medical experts to challenge the official findings at every turn. They used social media to bypass traditional news outlets, sharing autopsy photos and surveillance footage stills that raised uncomfortable questions the authorities seemed eager to avoid. Their efforts ensured the case never faded from the public consciousness. Their fight attracted the support of civil rights leaders and activists from across the nation, who saw in Kendrick's case echoes of a long and painful history of racial injustice in the American South. The case became a flashpoint, a symbol of a justice system that too often failed black victims. The mounting public pressure, fueled by the Johnsons' tireless advocacy and the shocking findings of the second autopsy, became impossible to ignore. In October 2013, Michael Moore, the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, announced that the federal government was opening its own investigation into Kendrick's death, promising a thorough and independent review of all the evidence. The involvement of the Department of Justice and the FBI was a monumental victory for the Johnson family. It felt like a validation of their struggle, a sign that their voices had finally been heard at the highest levels. Federal investigators spent more than 2 years on the case, re-interviewing hundreds of witnesses, re-examining evidence and convening a grand jury. The Johnsons held on to a fragile hope that this new investigation would finally uncover the truth and lead to arrests. Their unwavering fight had taken their personal tragedy and turned it into a national cause, forcing a powerful system to look again at the boy in the mat. They had done everything a family could possibly do. After years of federal scrutiny, after hundreds of interviews and a grand jury probe, the moment of truth arrived. In June 2016, the Department of Justice announced its decision. There would be no federal charges filed in the death of Kendrick Johnson. The U.S. Attorney Michael Moore stated that after an exhaustive investigation, federal investigators had not found sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or some group of people willfully violated Kendrick Johnson's civil rights or committed any other prosecutable federal crime. The announcement was a devastating blow to the Johnson family and their supporters. The glimmer of hope that the federal government would deliver justice was extinguished. The DOJ's report detailed the immense scope of their investigation, acknowledging the unusual circumstances of Kendrick's death and the many conflicting theories. However, they concluded that the evidence simply did not support a conclusion of homicide. They could not disprove the original theory of a tragic accident, as bizarre as it seemed. The federal investigators, like the local authorities before them, felt they could not build a criminal case. The case was, once again, officially closed. For the legal system, the story of Kendrick Johnson had reached its final chapter. The brothers who had been the subject of intense suspicion were officially cleared, their names released from the cloud of the investigation. Yet, closing a case and solving a mystery are two very different things. For the Johnson family, the DOJ's decision was not an end, but another betrayal. They maintained their belief that their son was murdered and that the system had failed him at every level, local, state, and federal. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit, continuing their fight in the civil courts, though that too would eventually be withdrawn. The case was reopened one more time by the Lowndes County Sheriff in 2021, offering a brief flicker of new hope, but it was closed again a year later with the same conclusion: no evidence of foul play. The official record remained unchanged. So we are left where we began, in the echo of a silent gymnasium. The file on Kendrick Johnson may be stamped closed, but the questions linger, hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. The conflicting autopsies, the missing surveillance footage, the whispers of a fight, the whispers of a cover-up. The official story asks us to believe in a 1 in a million accident. The family asks us to believe in a conspiracy of silence. The truth, whatever it may be, remains trapped somewhere in between, as unreachable as Kendrick was in his final terrifying moments. Was Kendrick Johnson's death a tragic, improbable accident, or is the truth still hidden, waiting in the shadows of a small Georgia town?